What's up, hobby friends? My name is Casey and welcome to another miniature rescue. Let's get right into it and start talking about why it can be really daunting to paint expensive models. This video is sponsored by RIVENSTONE by Broken Anvil Miniatures. More on that in a little bit. I really have a problem painting large models. You got your great unclean ones, Maw Krushas, the occasional Troll Hag, Night Titans, Kronda Seas, and actual Warlord Titans. These models are all insanely incredible and I really enjoy the end result once I'm done painting them. But actually sitting down to paint a model like these can be extremely overwhelming for most painters. Think about it. You head to your local store, you see an incredible model, and it just calls to you, regardless of price, but probably more expensive. What's going on? Hey. You answer back, oh yes, it will be mine. So you buy it, you take it home, you eagerly build it, you make sure there aren't any mold lines or gaps, any issues that would detract from an amazing, beautiful piece of plastic, and you sit down to paint, but you just freeze up. How many of you can honestly say that you've been there? I know I have. These models are expensive, and the thought of committing paint to a model can be insanely overwhelming. What if I mess this paint job up? Am I gonna just waste money? Are people gonna laugh at me? Am I gonna be able to show my face at the hobby shop again? All of those things are considered thought distortions. Thought distortion or cognitive distortion is an exaggerated or irrational thought pattern that is perpetuated by things like anxiety. Expensive model, seemingly irreversible paint job. You better make the right decision on this model, right? Somewhere inside there is a little voice telling you that you aren't good enough to paint that expensive model, or that somehow you'll ruin it if you put paint on it. I'm telling you right now, those things are absolutely untrue. We feel anxious because the model is expensive, but in reality, the model is just a model. It's not different from any other model that we paint. Maybe it's a bit bigger, more complicated, but it's not actually different. The reason I'm bringing this up is because this week I decided to paint a Maw Krusha for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and I'm rescuing a big ironjawz army off of eBay. It's a big model and I don't really have a good idea of what I want to do with it, and that's always my first clue that I'm probably telling myself things that aren't true in order to put off painting a really nice model, or an expensive one. So how can we move past these thought distortions and begin to make actual progress? Well, let me walk you through my process and get this nasty cabbage dragon all painted up. First, I find that taking it one step at a time is a huge motivator and keeps me engaged with a project. This model had a ton of work up front because of the condition it was in when I got it. Broken and missing pieces, there are puzzles to solve and progress to make. It doesn't have to be a lot of progress, but once you start, you'll feel a lot better about that process as you start to get down that road. So I fixed up the dragon, I fixed up the rider, and I got the model primed. Now I decided to let the model sit for a little while, and that's kind of when those thought distortions started to make their way in. The longer that I have a project open, the more likely it is that I'm not going to come back to it. I have no actual agenda for this model other than adding it to my existing army, so there are no real stakes. Not finishing it would only affect me. By creating an end goal for your model, having something to do at the end of painting it, you're way more likely to actually pick it up to paint. Personally, I do find that leaving a model out nearby my hobby desk keeps that model top of mind, and I continually think about it. What kinds of colors would work, what fun things I can try on such a large model, so on and so forth, until I feel that twinge of inspiration hit me and I can't do anything else but to start painting. Sometimes it's just about committing and seeing where that takes you. Putting paint on a brush and sitting down at your desk can be a huge catalyst for actually painting a mini. Go figure. Regardless of the size or cost. You're there, the model's there, the brush is loaded. Where do you go from there? I also really like to draw inspiration from the amazing community of painters out there. I use Instagram a lot because it has a great selection of curated pictures that I can go through to get ideas from. Color combinations, techniques, whatever it is. Taking in outside inspiration can get you fired up to start that painting process. Something that really helps me get started is using a specific kind of technique, something that expedites the process and gets me into it really quickly. For larger models, I particularly like to use filters. What I mean by that is I start with a dark base coat or even the primer, and use white ink through an airbrush or dry brush to create areas of color. This black and white sketch, if you will, is a representation of where that color will be lightest or darkest. When that sketch is done, I take a transparent ink or acrylic paint and go over the entire model. The transparency of the paint uses that black and white information and gives us a colorful model with shifting tones. It's a great way to start large models because you tend to make an absolute ton of progress in a relatively short amount of time, giving you that motivation to keep going. This model was interesting in that I started in one place and I kind of ended up in a completely different place. I had a green dragon in mind with some yellow pre-highlights to boost that green on top, using filters. But I grabbed the wrong color. Normally I mix golden high flow green and blue to get a really nice teal color. In this case, I meant to just go with green, but I grabbed blue. Once the color started going down though, my mind was changed and all of a sudden I absolutely wanted a blue dragon. Dealing with all or nothing thinking is another type of cognitive distortion. What it means is the way you're thinking about something is either a success or a failure. Either it's good or bad. There's no in between. I had green in mind and I screwed that up pretty badly, but paint is interesting in that you can just keep painting and nothing is really ever set in stone. And even when you think it is, you can just take that paint off and start over. There's nothing permanent in miniature painting when it comes to paint. I have enough videos on this channel proving that you would think that I'd be over this kind of weird thought process by now. Even then, I had a moment of panic until I took a breath and I kept painting. The green was eaten up by the blue and I moved on to some icy highlights. Before we continue, let me tell you about today's incredible sponsor. Broken Anvil Miniatures has just launched their Kickstarter for a new miniature skirmish war game, RIVENSTONE. Set in a fantasy world where magic is a physical resource which grows in great crystalline deposits called Rivenstone. Players can collect, paint, and play their personal warband of miniatures as they battle each other for control of the crystal. The game is easy to learn, though it features plenty of tactical depth to explore and utilize on the tabletop. A player's warband typically consists of 8 to 15 models, making it an accessible game to pick up and start playing right away. In addition, the starter boxes for this game's various factions are fully playable warbands, meaning a player has everything they need to get started right out of the box. The art style of the game and its models is unique, a blend of high fantasy and wild magic. There are factions such as the Shattered Empire, which features knights bolstered by arcane prosthetics wielding gunblades. These warriors might face off against a faction such as the Oryx, massive orcs who tame wild, prehistoric looking beasts and ride them into battle. The array of model aesthetics as well as tabletop playstyles ensures that there is something for everyone. The game has been built and developed from the ground up by a team of industry veterans, and decades of experience have been poured into making Rivenstone the best game it can be. Broken Anvil is excited to finally get this game into the hands of everyone, as it is the beginning of a great new creative exploration. Simply put, BAM isn't building just a game, but a fantasy world that will be experienced through lore, artwork, and many other mediums. Best of all, their starter boxes, which contain upwards of 14 models and tokens, measuring tools, cards, and rules needed to play, will be available for $99. The Kickstarter is running until May 26th, so don't miss out on this awesome campaign. A huge thank you to Broken Anvil Miniatures for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to painting. Okay, so let me lay this distortion on you. Emotional reasoning is a type of cognitive distortion. It is assumed that feelings expose the true nature of things and experience reality as a reflection of emotionally linked thoughts. Something is believed true solely based on the way that you feel about it. A common thought is that because something looks bad halfway through, because your paint job is looking not so good, it's always going to look bad. That's a huge hurdle when it comes to all miniatures, and it's only magnified with larger models. I tend to get pretty discouraged at that point, and it happens all the time. But the more time that you spend painting, the more you come to realize that this is an integral part of the process. You start to question things, you make decisions, and eventually you pull it together and get a good looking model out of it. The more that you do that, the better decisions you end up making, leading to better and better end results. It's mostly just practice. After the dry brush of off-white over the entire dragon, you can really start to see things coming together. This is where I like to bring in a dark oil wash and really define those details. I mix together some Winsor & Newton black and odorless mineral spirits into a wash consistency, then proceed to apply it over the entire model. The oil wash really gets into those recesses and you can see the difference right away. Once the oil wash has had a little time to sit, I come back in with a makeup sponge and wipe away any excess wash from the top of the scales. Remember, if the wash dries, it isn't quite dark enough, you can always apply another coat or mix in a little more oil paint into the spirits to get a thicker black line. The thing with larger models is that we tend to look at them and immediately become overwhelmed. Like, somehow there will be more work because of the size. Generally, or at least in my experience, larger models tend to have less overall detail and rely on size and specific details to actually stand out. So it becomes easier to focus on those standout pieces and paint your model quicker than you might otherwise think. This model has only a few key features: the scales, the straps, the armor, the wings. Once those things are filled in, there really isn't a whole lot left to do on this model. There are other minor details like the scars on his face and all the spikes, but they're secondary. If you break a model down by what is actually important to paint, then you can prioritize those pieces. It makes you feel like you're making more progress when larger things, more important things get done first. Here I'm painting up the straps. There are several on each arm and they play an important role in bringing in a little more color to this model. I went with a white strap and washed that down with some sepia tone. The brownish orange is great with the blues and brings good attention to those areas of the model. Up next are the armor panels. I use the same technique and paints that I did on the other ironjawz that I've been working on, but in this case I wanted to focus more on that orange rust to continue to play into that blue-orange contrast. So on top of going pretty heavy with the rust paints, I brought in some orange pigment powder to give it a little extra boost. The great thing about pigment powders is how useful they are for a variety of things on a model. I really like it for bringing in a lifelike appearance to rusty things, as well as incorporating a model into its surroundings by covering it with whatever dirt is around, usually on the base. A few of those secondary details, and it's time to move on to the finishing touches. I really want this guy to have an interesting base, so I used some insulation foam to give him a little bit of an angled platform to rest on. The problem is his sculpt really wants him to be flat. So I either need to sculpt those angles into the foam or fill in the gaps with some basing materials. In this case, since the gaps aren't too bad where I want him to be sitting, a few bits of rock and grass tufts will easily hide the fact that he isn't perfectly flat on this base. So I applied more glue all over and I laid in grass, followed that up with some tiny rocks and grass tufts, and he was looking pretty good. The last thing to do is really get the model grounded to this base. Right now it feels okay, but doesn't really look like he's part of his environment. That's where those pigment powders come back in. You can mix and match tones to get a more natural look on a base. Darker browns, greens, things like that. But I'm gonna go with brown and orange to really make sure that this model looks bright. That contrast is really sticking out. All of those rocks get a good coating. The underside of the model, and especially the hands and feet, get hit with that powder. Immediately this model gets pulled into its surroundings, and it feels like he belongs. And it's a treatment that the rest of the army can have in order to really bring them all together, regardless of kind of how you do each base. So that mostly finishes off the important details on this model. Let's talk about a couple of other really important things and finish this guy out. So like I said, large models can be so overwhelming. The price of failure feels high, and we tell ourselves some crazy things to just justify not actually trying. All you really need to know is that you can do it. These models are just models, and you will enjoy actually painting them. Sure, you might be a better painter later on, or you can't quite think of the perfect colors to paint with today, but those are just excuses to actually put it off. Remember, paint is just paint. You can keep applying it and get through that ugly phase, or even strip it all off and start over. The important thing is that you got out a brush and you put paint on it in the first place. And if you did that once, you can do it again and again until you have something that you really like. Thank you again for joining me on another miniature rescue. If you like something about this video, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video.